Haboim, welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Nun Ches Amud Beis. Start with Nun Ches Amud Aleph, 7 lines from the bottom. We learned in the Mishnah in regards to the Korban Tamid Shel Bein Ha'arboim. There are 3 different types, or times rather, that it could be brought. In a regular classical situation, that means during the course of the year, it's brought, it means it's shechted 8.5 hours into the day, and it's nikrav an hour later, 9.5 hours into the day. However, when it's Erev Pesach, we're makdim 1 hour, because since the Korban Pesach has to be brought after the Korban Tamid Shel Bein Ha'arboim, we need more time to bring all the korbanos of the Korban Pesach, whereby the Korban Tamid Shel Bein Ha'arboim is brought in the 7.5 hour. That's when it's shechted, and then it's nikrav on 8.5 hours. However, on Erev Shabbos, when Erev Pesach comes out on Erev Shabbos, then you need even more time. Because here, not only does it have to be brought after the Korban Tamid Shel Bein Ha'arboim, but the Korban Pesach also requires to be eaten, at least a kazayis for each person in the Chabura, of roasted meat of the Korban Pesach. Thereby, the Korban Pesach, which is shechted in the afternoon, has to have been roasted before Shabbos. So therefore, we're makdim even 1 hour before that. In other words, the earliest time we'll then bring the Korban Tamid Shel Bein Ha'arboim, that's 6.5 hours into the day. That's when we shecht it. And again, it's nikrav. We bring it up on the Mizbeach 1 hour later, 7.5 hours into the day, giving enough time for then the Korban Pesach to be brought in the afternoon and then to be roasted before Shabbos. The Gemara then brings a brisa, and there's a machlokes between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva in this brisa, as follows. When do we say Shabbos, which is Erev Pesach, what is the hour that you bring the Korban Tamid Shel Bein Ha'arboim? On that, Rabbi Yishmael says, according to Abaye, that you bring it on the 7.5 hour, just like on every other Erev Pesach. On that, Rabbi Akiva argues and says, since it's Shabbos and there's no need to bring Nidarim and Nidavo, his personal karbonos, before the Korban Pesach, and since over here it's Shabbos, whereby you'll need enough time anyways to bring the Korban Pesach, so there's no reason why not to be makdim the earliest possible, which is 6.5 hours into the day. That's how Abai explains the machlokes. Says our Gemara, Maskif la Rava. Rava takes issue with Abai's explanation. Midei Rabbi Akiva besidroi be'erev Pesach shechalios be'erev Shabbos ketani. Did the words of Rabbi Akiva say that you are going to then mesader the Korban Tamid Shel Bein Ha'arboim on erev Pesach that is chal on erev Shabbos? Which would imply, like you're saying, then it would be 6.5 hours into the day. It doesn't say that. Kisid roi be'erev Pesach stama kitani. In other words, it doesn't say anything about erev Pesach falling out on erev Shabbos. So there's no reason to interpret Rabbi Akiva as requiring the Korban Tamid to be brought 6.5 hours into the day, because it only says kisido be'erev haPesach, like any other erev Pesach. Elomar Rave. Therefore, Rave says hachi ka'amar. This is how you have to explain the machlokes between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. Kisidroi bechol da'alma kach sidroi b'Shabbos be'erev Shabbos di Rabbi Yishmael. He understands Rabbi Yishmael is saying that just like on all other days of the year, when you would bring the Korban Tamid Shel Bein Ha'arboim, it would be 8.5 hours into the day. That's when it would be shechted. So too, when Shabbos comes out to be on Erev Pesach, you would also bring it, you would shecht it on 8.5 hours into the day. Rabbi Akiva oimer kisidroi be'erev haPesach. Whereas Rabbi Akiva would be arguing, and he says that also on Shabbos, like any other Erev Pesach, you would then bring it, you would shecht the Korban Tamid 7.5 hours into the day. Umas nisin diktani, and that which our Mishnah teaches, bein bechol bein b'Shabbos, that on Erev Shabbos, that you will then have the same din. Sorry, on Erev Pesach, you'll have the same din during the week as you would on Erev Shabbos. These are the words of Rabbi Akiva. This is the words of Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva is saying that the same way on Erev Pesach, during the week, it would be 7.5 hours. So too, when when Shabbos comes in to be Erev Pesach, it would also be 7.5 hours. The Gemara now explains this machlekes according to the way Rav is explaining. B'mai kamifilgi. What is Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva arguing? B'michmar bisra kamifilgi. They're arguing about when the meat will become heated up. Will it spoil or not? Rabbi Shmuel savar chashin lemichmar bisra. Rabbi Shmuel says you should bring the carbon on Shabbos. The Korban Tamid 8.5 hours into the day. He's concerned because the meat, since you're going to leave it, you can't do anything with it until after Shabbos. So therefore, he would be concerned if we bring it earlier, the meat would then be heated up and spoil. Whereas Rabbi Akiva savar lo chashin lemichmar bisra. Rabbi Akiva is not concerned about that, and therefore he says you can bring up the Korban Tamid shel ben arboim 7.5 hours into the day. On top of Nun Ches Amud Beis. Ask the Gemara, if you, Rabbi Akiva, are not worried about the meat spoiling on Shabbos, when therefore you say it should be brought up 7.5 hours, so then why not be makdim another hour to 6.5 hours? In other words, since there's so many korban pesachs to bring, so why not just bring the korban tamid shel ben harboim the earliest possible, which is 6.5 hours into the day? Answers the Gemara, because kasavar musafin koitmin lebazichin. Because Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that the korban musaf, which is brought on Shabbos, that precedes the spoons. The spoons over here is lavoina. We had mentioned last time that the lechem haponim is taken the week from the week before on Shabbos and replaced with a new one on Shabbos, and then is distributed to the kohanim to eat. However, the spoons of lavoina have to first be brought and burnt on the mizbeach, the lavoina, to then permit the kohanim to eat the new, or the old rather, lechem haponim. So according to Rabbi Akiva, the korban musaf is brought before the lavoina is burnt, and therefore avi lehu melusafim b'sheish. We bring the korban musaf, the musaf is on the 6th hour. Ubezichin b'sheva. 1 hour later is the zichin, these spoons of lavoina. Ve'avi le'tamid b'sheva u'mechza. Then we can bring the korban tamid 7.5 hours into the day. Therefore, it's not possible for Rabbi Akiva to then allow the korban tamid shel ben arboim to be brought 6.5 hours. He has to then require that be 7.5 hours. Maskif lo Rabbi Bar Ulo. Rabbi Bar Ulo now asks on Rava's explanation. In other words, Rava asked on Abaye's explanation. Now Rabbi Bar Ulo is going to ask on Rava's explanation. Midi, and again, Rava just said that according to Rabbi Yishmael, on Shabbos, this is Erev Pesach, you're bringing it up at 7.5 hours. Sorry, 8.5 hours into the day. And Rabbi Akiva says 7.5 hours. Says the Gemara, what is his challenge against Rava? Midi b'kisidroi bechol kach sidroi b'Shabbos be'erev Pesach. The Rabbi Shmuel Ketani, did it state the words of Rabbi Shmuel that just like the weekday korban tamid shel ben harboim, so too when it's going to be on Shabbos erev Pesach? Does it state that in the words of Rabbi Yishmael? Kach sidroi b'Shabbos stama ketani. It only says this is the Seder on Shabbos, but it doesn't mention that it's going to be Shabbos on Erev Pesach. That's what Rabbi Bar Ula points out as a deficiency for Rava's Pshat. And therefore, Ela Omar Rabbi Bar Ula Hachi Ketani. This is what I have to learn the Machlekes. Very simply. Kesidroi bechol da alma, kachsido b'Shabbos da alma. Just like the korban tamid shel ben ha'arboim throughout the year is brought 8.5 hours into the day, so too on Shabbos is brought 8.5 hours into the day. Rabbi Akiva oimer kisido be'erev ha'pesach ba'alma kachsido b'Shabbos da'alma. And Rabbi Akiva argues and he says that just like on Erev Pesach, any time during the year, it's 7.5 hours into the day that the korban tamid is brought, so too, therefore, when it's on Shabbos, it should also be brought 7.5 hours into the day. The Gemara now points out, Umasnis in our Mishnah, Diktani bein bechol bein b'Shabbos, when our Mishnah states, there's no distinction, there's no difference between Shabbos and Chol. Divrei HaKoli, it would come out to be according to everybody, both Rabbi Yishmael as well as according to Rabbi Akiva, because both Rabbi Yishmael says that both during the weekday as well as on the Shabbos it will be brought 8.5 hours, and according to Rabbi Akiva, whether it's the weekday or it's on Shabbos Erev Pesach, it's going to be brought 7.5 hours. The Gemara now explains what is taka the machlokes between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva according to the way Rabbi Bar Ula is explaining. B'gzeiras nidvois v'nidarim kemifilgi. They are arguing about the giving. When we say you have to have certain karbonos, those personal karbonos, that if they're going to be brought, they have to be brought before the korban tamid shel bein haraboyim. So what is the machlokes? As follows: Rabbi Yishmael sovar gazrin and Shabbos atuchol. Rabbi Yishmael is concerned that since during the week we need to then extend and bring the korban tamid shel bein haraboyim 8.5 hours into the day to allow enough time, 2 hours before that, to then be able to bring brought all the nidarim and nidavos to the Beis Hamikdash. Therefore, on Shabbos also, we'll do the same thing, because he's concerned if we then are makdim the hour of the Korban Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim on Shabbos, then we might do so during the week, whereby if we have to bring Nidarim and Davos, it won't be enough time. They'll be brought after the Korban Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim, which would be a psul. Rabbi Yishmael, so that's Rabbi Yishmael. He saw Gazrin on Shabbos, Atuchol. Rabbi Akiva saw Loy Gazrinon. And therefore, Rabbi Akiva, who argues, he says that we don't make a gezerah, and therefore on Shabbos, just like the Chol, we will then bring on Shabbos 7.5 hours into the day. We're not worried about then being makdim during the week as well. Iloi gazrinon na'avdi bevav umechza. Ask the Gemara the question that we saw earlier on Rabbi Akiva's shita. If indeed Rabbi Akiva does not make a gezerah, and he's not worried about being makdim on Shabbos, that will also affect the Chol, so then why not be makdim the earliest possible time? Zrizim makdim in the mitzvahs, and therefore have them bring the korban tamid shel ben arbaim 6.5 hours into the day. Anyways, there's no nidavim nidavos, so why not bring it then? Answers the Gemara like we answered before as well. Kisova, because Rabbi Akiva holds musafin koidim libazichin, because Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion, again, that korban musaf must be brought before the levoina is burnt on the mizbeach, and therefore musafim b'sheish v'zichin b'sayin. The korban musaf is brought in the 6th hour, whereas the levoina is burnt on the mizbeach in the 7th hour. And therefore the korban tamid is shechted 7.5 hours into the day. The Gemara now brings the following brisa as a challenge to the opinion above. Meisvei. Tamid kol hashana kula karev b'hilchosoi. The korban tamid, the entire year, is brought up kihalacha, nishchat b'shmoina umechza, v'karev b'teisha mechza. It is shechted 8.5 hours into the day, and 1 hour later it is brought on the mizbeach. Ube'erev haPesach nishchat bevav umechza v'karev b'ches umechza. On Erev Pesach, we are makdim 1 hour, and therefore it's shechted 7.5 hours into the day, and it's brought on the mizbeach 8.5 hours into the day. Chal lihiyois b'Shabbos. If it's chal, that means Erev Pesach, to be on Shabbos, then kechal liyos b'sheni b'Shabbos. It's like as if Erev Pesach came out to be on any other weekday, like this Monday, like Sheni b'Shabbos. And therefore, just like on Sheni b'Shabbos would be 7.5 hours into the day, so too, then on Shabbos, if that's going to be Chal Erev Pesach on Shabbos, it would also be 7.5 hours into the day. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael, these are the words of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva oimer kisidroi be'erev haPesach. Rabbi Akiva says the seder of the korban tamid shel ben arbaim is the same on Erev haPesach. Gemara will explain now. Bishlam le'Abaye. That's very well according to Abaye. It's nicha, because after all, Abaye said exactly that. He said that the korban tamid shel ben ha'arbaim, according to Rabbi Yishmael, should be 7.5 hours into the day, and according to Rabbi according to Abaye, it's Necha, because Abaye said that Rabbi Shmuel holds that when Erev Pesach comes out to be on Shabbos, then it'll be brought 7.5 hours into the day, like any other day of the year. Whereby Rabbi Akiva will be saying that it would be, when he said Kesidro be'erev Pesach, he's talking about that it will have to be brought 6.5 hours into the day. In other words, Rabbi Akiva must be meaning that it's talking about the din is that when Erev Pesach comes out to be on Erev Shabbos, that would be the din on Shabbos as well. Let's take a look inside at Rashi. Bishlam ala Abaye necha. That's very well according to what Rabbi said. The Medekom Rabbi Yishmael chal liyois b'Shabbos, kechal liyois b'Sheni b'Shabbos. Just as Rabbi Yishmael said that when it comes out to be on Shabbos, will be no different than the rest of the year. He doesn't make a distinction. Al korchoch kisidroi erev haPesach. Dekom Rabbi Akiva be'erev Pesach shechal liyois be'erev Shabbos komar. Therefore, Rabbi Akiva must be meaning that the din of Shabbos, when Shabbos comes out in Erev Pesach, has the din of Erev Pesach coming out to be on Erev Shabbos. In other words, 6.5 hours into the day. That is how it's Nech according to Abaye. Ela l'Rave, the Gemara asks, is a kasha. But the way Rava understands, that's difficult. Says Rashi, Ela l'Rave, they come Rabbi Shmuel, l'michmar bisro. Rabbi Rava explains that the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael is to bring the Korban Tamid 8.5 hours into the day because he's worried about it getting spoiled. Then that's going to be difficult. How does that stem with Rabbi Shmuel over here? Says Rashi, "Dekam Rabbi Shmuel the Michmar Bisro Chayish Ukesidor Bechol Ba'alma Ka'omar Ha Kitani Hacha Kechal Yos B'Shem B'Shabbos." But over here, according to Rabbi Shmuel, it's mashma that it's like every other day of the year, which is going to be 7.5 hours into the day. So that's not like Rava explained that it will be 8.5 hours into the day. Omar loch Rava, Rava will say to you, Lo teima kechal b'sheni b'Shabbos, ela eimo kesheni b'Shabbos de alma. Don't read that Rabbi Shmuel is talking about when it's chal on sheni b'Shabbos, dahainu on Erev Pesach, whereby we said it's 7.5 hours into the day, but rather Kesheni b'Shabbos de Alma, like any other weekday, like a Monday during the course of the year, that's not Erev Pesach. That would be 8.5 hours into the day. So now it stems with Rava's Shita of Rabbi Shmuel. Meisvei, the Gemara asks another question from a different brayso. Chali yois b'Shabbos kisidroi kol hashana kulo di Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel says in this brayso, when it's chal on Shabbos, that means Erev Pesach is chal on Shabbos, then it's the Korban Tamid is brought as it is in the rest of the year. Dahainu 8.5 hours into the day. Those are the words of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva oimer kisidroi be'erev haPesach de alma. Whereas Rabbi Akiva says that it's going to be 7.5 hours into the day, like any other Erev Pesach, even when it comes on Shabbos. Bishlama l'Rava necha. According to Rava, it's very good. Because Rava said that according to Rabbi Shmuel, it's brought in the 8.5 hours into the day, and on Shabbos, and Rabbi Akiva would say 7.5 hours into the day. It's exactly what's being said over here. Ela Abaye. But according to Abaye, Kasha is going to be difficult because according to Abaye, on Erev Pesach, on Shabbos, it's also 7.5 hours into the day, according to Rabbi Yishmael. So over here, how is that going to fit? Because this statement of Rabbi Shmuel says 8.5 hours into the day. Omar loch Abaye lo yitema kisidroi kol hashana ela ema kisidroi kol hashanim. Don't read it to be that it's kisidroi, the words of Rabbi Shmuel, of kol hashana, dahainu, a situation of 8.5 hours. Ela ema kisidroi kol hashanim, dahainu 7.5 hours. Kulon, di Rabbi Shmuel. In other words, Abaye is explaining that it's not difficult according to me because the way I'm going to explain the words of Rabbi Shmuel over here is don't say like it is kol hashana, that it means 8.5 hours into the day. A typical bringing of the Korban Tamid Shel Ben Harboim. Rather, say that we're talking about that on Kol HaShonim, the Hainu, when it's on Erev Pesach, where it will be 7.5 hours. Those are the words of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Kesido Erev HaPesach Shechal Liyos Be'erev Shabbos, and therefore it will be 6.5 hours into the day, just as Abai had explained before.